Hey there, welcome to YouTube. If you are into poetry, if you are into literature, if you are into cultural history, then you've come to the right place. Cardboard Box Productions makes podcasts about all those things, so be sure to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so that you never miss a new episode. Obviously, we mostly make podcasts, so you can also go to anywhere you get your podcasts, if it's a place other than YouTube, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and you can subscribe to our podcast feeds there. All right, I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast from Cardboard Box Productions Incorporated. I am co-host Jack Rossiter-Munley, and with my good friend Connor McNamara Stratton, we read a poem,
talk about the poem,
and read the poem again.
Before we get into today's selection, a quick note that if you like what we do here at Close Talking and have a spare minute of your time, it would mean the world to us if you would give the podcast a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Those ratings and reviews help boost us up the algorithm and find new listeners.
And if you have suggestions for future episodes or comments on this one, you can send us an email at closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com.
And you can also find us on social media. On Twitter, the show is @CloseTalking. I am @JackRossiter-Munn, and Connor is @ConnorM.Stratton. On Instagram, the show is @CloseTalkingPoetry, and on Facebook, it's facebook.com/CloseTalking. We also have a website, closetalking.com, where you can find all the past episodes of the show, and Cardboard Box Productions has just launched a newsletter, Unboxed, and if you go to cardboardboxproductionsinc.com, you can subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stuff on Close Talking and all of the other literary and cultural history podcasts that Cardboard Box Productions makes. On with the show. Welcome to a brand new episode of Close Talking. I am Jack Rossiter-Munley.
And I am Connor McNamara Stratton.
And together we are two dudes with one love of poetry. Today's poem is a first in Close Talking history. It is the first poem that was not selected by myself and not selected by Connor. It was selected by one of our internet gentle people.
E-fans, e-friends, web friends, Twitter friends.
Twitter compatriots.
All right, tell them, who was it?
So this tweet pal, gender non-specific because the gender is unknown, can be found at Deep State Radio Nerds. They are the unofficial fan account of the Deep State Radio podcast, which if you don't listen to, I highly recommend you check out. It features a whole bunch of very smart, articulate foreign policy and national security professionals who have as much fun talking about those issues as we do talking about poetry here. They've got inside jokes. They've got fan accounts on Twitter for their pets, real and imagined, and one of them even has an account for his pastrami sandwich. So definitely check out that show, because it's like, if you're familiar with the McElroy brothers and their brand of podcasting, it's like if that was being done by people who have spent their whole lives crafting policy. It's fantastic.
I listened to a few. I got it queued up. I'm a subscriber.
It's good stuff. The point of all this is that dear sweet at Deep State Radio Nerds suggested this poem, which is the poem Memory by Siegfried Sassoon. I think we'll dig right into the poem and do some biographical details of Sassoon a little bit later on, because this poem is, as most of his are, in equal measures sad and angry and deeply engaged with questions of what war brings to a human's experience. So this is Memory by Siegfried Sassoon. When I was young, my heart and head were light, and I was gay and feckless as a colt, out in the fields with morning in the May, wind on the grass, wings in the orchard bloom. Oh, thrilling sweet my joy when life was free, and all the paths led on from hawthorn-time across the caroling meadows into June. But now, my heart is heavy-laden. I sit, burning my dreams away beside the fire, for death has made me wise and bitter and strong. And I am rich in all that I have lost. O starshine on the fields of long ago, bring me the darkness and the nightingale, dim wealds of vanished summer, peace of home and silence and the faces of my friends.
Cool. It's a throwback poem. It's World War One.
Yeah, other than the Emily Dickinson poem, this may be the farthest back we've ever reached.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, we talked briefly in our episode on What the Living Do about the quote-unquote poem feeling that one sometimes gets at the end of a poem. And I feel like, at least for me, the end of this poem, much like the end of What the Living Do, gives me that quote-unquote poem feeling of just like, damn.
Yeah, and we should get to the bio, but I want to talk about the ending because that's the real clincher part in a lot of ways. So it's got some goods, some nuggets.
It brings a whole new aspect to the poem, because at first you think there's two things going on in the poem. There's this time that's remembered fondly, and there's this new time that is not great. But all of a sudden, it's not just about a good time before bad things happened and a time after the bad things happened. There is now a longing for what was lost in a new way with the introduction of other people. It's the death of friends. It's the loss of friends and that experience.
Yeah. He was an officer in World War One. Is that true? Or did he fight? Because I feel like it's like not just the death of people, not just the death of friends, but it's the death of friends within the context of a mass, global catastrophe that is World War One.
Yeah, Sassoon was an officer, and more importantly, he was a little bit older than a lot of the men he was fighting with, and most famously, he was older than Wilfred Owen, who is linked to him as sort of a writing, not so much protege, but he was definitely a mentor figure to Owen. Owen is also a very famous poet from this period who died young during the war. Sassoon actually lived on until 1967. And the two of them are linked partially because of their time spent together at Craig Lockhart, which was a mental facility, basically, where men suffering from shell shock at the front could go. And a lot of early psychological techniques were pioneered there, many of which were pretty bad. Electroshock therapy, a lot of quick fixes that were almost like slapping a Band-Aid on a deep issue so that whoever the person was who was suffering from some kind of trauma from the battlefield could immediately be sent back, which fits into all of the different narratives about World War I and replicability, industrialization. These men are treated in the hospital much like replaceable components in a machine. Just fix the brain, send them back into the foxholes until they get shell shock again. They come back to the hospital, they go back to the foxholes. It's a whole cycle that isn't interested in the individual. It isn't interested in actually treating the problem. It's interested in shipping somebody back to the front. Sassoon comes into this particularly because he calls out the British government on it. And he calls them out about the war, not just in his poems, but he actually writes a letter about it that gets him into massive trouble with the government to the point that they want to throw him in jail. Sassoon, not just in chronicling his experience through his poetry, but also through his political engagement, was a figure who, if not super popular, was at least somewhat known and had definitely staked out what his relationship to this conflict was. If you are interested in a really great literary account of Craig Lockhart, there is a trilogy of books called the Regeneration Trilogy by Pat Barker, and they are incredible. And they deal with all of these different issues, and they take Sassoon and Owen and other real historical figures and their real experiences as their jumping off point. And they're just brilliant books. So highly recommend Pat Barker's Regeneration Trilogy.
And if you're interested in poetry, World War I just listened to these today.
Poetry Spoken Here, our sibling podcast. I'm not sure the exact filial relationship. Poetry Spoken Here, which usually Jack said Charlie's the host, but in these 2 episodes, Jack is doing the hosting, episodes 20 and 24, with Sam Grake, and she talked to Jack about the influence of the war on German and British poetry and literature. Really good, highly recommend, and a great sort of follow-up if you're piqued by this.
Thank you for that programming note plug. Those are good conversations if you want more of the historical and cultural context for the conversation on this poem, because we always try to give a little bit of that, but we're a half-hour show. We like to dig into the meat of the poem and give not just the historical context, but also the close literary textual analysis equal time.
Speaking of meat of the poem, so let's just dig in and give a little aboutness, walk through what's happening. 2 sort of ways of doing that. The first, I'll say briefly, and then we'll talk about the poem specifically. And this was touched on in those Poetry Spoken Here episodes, but it's really interesting to think about this poem as a sort of built-in before and after World War I in terms of like as a microcosm of literature. So in the first, it's made up of 2 stanzas. The first one begins when I was young, my heart and head were light, da 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 da, and then the second stanza, but now my heart is heavy laden. And the first stanza has a very obvious conventional romanticism. So it feels like Keatsian or pastoral or Wordsworth, where there's, you're gay and feckless as a colt in the fields. There's mourning, and the rhythm too feels more flowing. It's not harsh. There's not a lot of enjambments really, or intense enjambments, and in fact there's actually no verb really. It's kind of just when I was la, when I was wa, oh it was great. But it's just like, oh, thrilling sweet. It's not, oh, it was thrilling sweet. It's just a timeless sort of verbless memory of sort of romantic loveliness. Notable too that Sassoon was sort of, I believe, upper class aristocrat, so his life probably actually was that good. It's just funny because sometimes the conversation is like, World War I was so terrible, and it was, but it's like, it wasn't like glory for everyone. And then the war happened. It's just, it was particularly terrible for everyone, but there was a lot, especially I guess towards the end of the war, a lot of lower middle class people, men were being thrown into the ranks. And anyway,
I think that's a great note because life changed for basically everyone, regardless of social class, because of World War I and because of the changes that it brought in the way that nations were organized, in the way that work was organized, in the, just in the layout of the map of Europe. As Connor and I shared an AP Euro teacher in high school, as Jessica Young would say, World War I changed everything. But there was a particular disruption in upper class life that happened as a result of World War I, particularly in Britain. And this poem definitely captures that unique disruption and alteration.
Yes. And so to think about it in the 2 ways that I'm talking about, in the poem specifically, we have Sassoon's memory, or the speaker's memory, of a beautiful pastoral youth. And then on the other hand, we think of the first stanza as sort of a romantic formalism of pretty fields, not naive or without depth, but focused on aesthetic beauty and direct expression. We think about Wordsworth, poetry is passionate feeling recollected in tranquility.
There's also the key romantic feature of the individual human subsumed by the landscape or overwhelmed by the power of nature, because we don't get a sense of where the individual I is in relation to any of this. It's a very ephemeral I, and the focus is all on the grass and the sweet joy and all of the experience, but not on the person. Mm-hmm. The landscape and the feeling completely dominates the individual, whereas the project of the second part of the poem, Toes, I know you're getting there, but the project of the second part of the poem is bringing us down and into the thought process of a human person. We don't get descriptions of any kind of landscape other than the landscape of the personal interiority of, because he's the author, let's say Sassoon.
Yeah, no, totally. That's really interesting. That's a great point. And so the second stanza, as Jack's already said, we get into the person, and but now my heart is heavy laden. I sit burning my dreams away beside the fire, for death has made me wise. I have lost. There's darkness, silence, remembering faces of my friends. So that, as we think about the personal, total loss, devastation, and the presence of Sassoon lies in what he no longer has. As that's what that great line, I am rich in all that I have lost. That's now where, his wealth or his substance is. Whereas before, in the first stanza, he finds the richness in the fields themselves or something. And then to think about that also as a kind of microcosm of literature from World War I, we move into modernism, and as a kind of rejection or a subversion or some sort of confrontation with the romantic ideals. And we have a devastation. Yeah, and so I really love that line, bring me the darkness and the nightingale, especially the nightingale. It makes you think of Keats. And I did a little research, found this scholarly article that is called Modernism, Male Intimacy and the Great War by Sarah Cole, came out in 2001. And I like this line here. It talks about how these last lines hail a Keatsian darkness and the nightingale. And then this line I think is worth quoting and thinking about the poem as a sort of modernist text against the sort of romantic history. Quote, having taken on the mantle of romantic poet, the writer now indicates what differentiates this war text from its precursor lyrics in the 19th century, as the death of friends becomes the essential material that constitutes the new self. It is finally the faces of lost friends that drive the poet to write. And then, if modernism here defines itself as the heir to romanticism, it nevertheless asserts its own refusal to be healed by memory, rigidly maintaining its claim of primacy in suffering, and leaving us, like the poet himself, with the permanent echo of intensified and broken intimacy.
I like that a lot.
Yeah, which is kind of intense. And I'll let you riff on it, but just as a quick echo, when I gave my horribly butchered generalization schematic in our last podcast about the Herrera poem, Notes on the Assemblage, about modernism and postmodernism, my brief sketch about modernism was that we have an alienated self. And so there's something, and World War I had a lot to do with that, in that there's a trauma that disrupts our ability to have a cohesive identity, or have an identity that's not constituted by some very violent absence, as it is in this case. And so what this scholar is sort of identifying in the Sassoon poem is that kind of alienation and rupture.
Definitely. Part of how that manifests also in post-World War I literature is a real distrust of language as a means of conveying meaning because of how language was twisted in the service of a war that was essentially a trench war where there was very little movement, a whole lot of death, but nations creating stories about themselves to basically send young men to their deaths. Writers who come out of that, in the Lost Generation, most famously, but in many of the writers who come out of that, modernist writers, there is this uncertainty around language as a way to express the self. So the literature that comes out of World War I is infused with that uncertainty. So that quote from that article is super cool.
Yeah.
And it gave me this thought.
Oh, what was your thought?
Right? Like,
oh my
that's
God.
that's what scholarship should do. So the thought that I had is that this is two different settings in which this person writing would sit down to write a poem. The first is the field on your estate, or some place where you're going to sit down and write the kind of poem that you've been trained to write by your private tutors as a young upper-class British person who's going to go on to be a gentleman and a man of letters as well as a man of business. You cogitate upon the beauty of the meadow and the skylark and all this other nonsense. But then the war happens, and when you sit down and think about trying to write a poem, you sit burning your dreams away. You are wise and bitter and strong because of the death that you've seen. And you're looking to those fields of long ago, but you see them with new eyes. And what you really are confronted with in this moment of silence and contemplation is silence and the faces of your friends who you've lost.
Yeah, that's really good. And I like, too, especially thinking about that I feel like the poem could easily have been some version of just the second stanza, where it's like just the devastation, etc. But the part that is sort of what you're getting at, the poem, and the part that is kind of the modernist element, is that both of them are the poem. That there is the pastoral romantic beauty that is staring you in the face as something you can no longer access because you've been wrecked in the war or in some other capacity. So that, this was something you said in the podcast episode with Sam, but the present absence is very necessary. That we're not just rejecting or dismissing the tropes of romanticism, but we are looking at them and thinking about how we can no longer have them. And they're sort of haunting us from this new vantage, from this second place of writing a poem.
Definitely. I like that. It made me think actually of Bruce Springsteen, as most things do. But he was deeply influenced by the Vietnam War. He didn't actually serve in that war, but he knew tons of people who did because he came from a working class neighborhood in New Jersey and had a lot of friends who went and served. And he tells a story about the drummer in his first band who went and never came back. And everything about the experience of being around during Vietnam and seeing people serve and understanding that maybe you can't trust the leaders of your country had a major impact on his politics as he was growing up and on his songwriting. And he writes lots of songs about veterans, and he's really fascinated by what happens when veterans come back or don't come back. And he has more than one song that is about exactly this kind of presence of absence.
A small rhythmic formal note that I think might get at a little bit why the end has a particular whoosh or jab or edge or goosebumps thing is, so the first stanza really has, I mentioned this flow, but I want to sort of explain that more. So the first line is, when I was young, my heart and head were light. There's no commas there. It's, the whole phrase basically occupies the line. And that is, in a way, like easy to read. So that's like got a nice flow, if that makes sense. And basically that stanza continues in a similar way for the most of the stanza. So, and I was gay and feckless as a colt. And then we have a line break, which is something, but the line break's not that bad because it just goes into out in the fields with morning in the May. So it's not like the end of the line isn't a verb, it's just the end of a colt. And then there's more description out in the fields with morning in the May. And then the next line is just continuing description. Wind on the grass, wings in the orchard bloom. And there's a nice sort of cadence there. And then, oh, thrilling sweet my joy when life was free, and all the paths led on from hawthorn-time across the caroling meadows into June. And so those three lines basically are one sentence. And the line breaks are basically at the ends of phrases. So the third to last line, when life was free, line break, and all the paths led on. So there's, the and is beginning a new phrase as the line begins anew. And this is just to say, it's nice to read, it's easy to read, it makes sense. You're not being told two different things with your eyes. And then immediately the second stanza messes that up. And it really does a lot of work, I think, to cue you into this being a drastic change. So, but now my heart is heavy laden, I sit. So we have the but, obviously we know it's different, and the images are telling us this too, my heart is heavy, but also there's a caesura, the sentence ends on heavy laden, but there's still two more words left on the line. And so we sort of end with a bit of a snap. And then we have a pretty intense enjambment because of that. I sit burning my dreams away beside the fire. So I feel like that is the first move that cranks it in a new direction.
That first line could just as easily have been written as one piece, and it could say, I sit now, my heart heavy laden, line break, burning my dreams away beside the fire. It gets the same idea across, but it doesn't use the poetic tools. It doesn't get it across as effectively or as artfully.
Right. There are many ways that he could have conveyed those images with the same flow as he was using in the first stanza. But he makes a deliberate rhythmic choice not to, that reflects the shift and shatter that the content is conveying. And then I think, the end too, I won't go through the whole second stanza, but the end, I actually don't know how to articulate, but it's sort of very weird. The fourth to last line, oh, starshine on the fields of long ago, bring me the darkness and the nightingale. So those are two long lines, and they have a nice imperative, which I think is notable. And also it's sort of, it's conjuring even a certain element of the romantic of the nightingale, bring me the darkness and the nightingale. But then there's a semicolon, and then dim wealds of vanished summer, peace of home, and then there's a line break and a comma, and this is what's weird, and silence, which is on the next line, and then there's a semicolon, and the faces of my friends. And I think what's odd about this deliberately is the piece of home, from a line perspective, the piece of home being on its own line, you want a bigger pause there, right? But from a syntactical sentence perspective, you want a bigger pause after silence, because that's where the semicolon is, but also those are more connected, and the faces of my friends is a separate point. So I think there's kind of a double slowing that's happening, where it's like dim wealds of vanished summer, piece of home, line break, and silence, semicolon, and the faces of my friends. Which then I think when that hits, it's kind of, you've been like jerked around and you're a little disoriented, and then suddenly you're confronted with the faces of my friends.
It honestly reminds me of volleyball, because the ideal volleyball point is bump, set, spike, and that's exactly what this does. Right? Like the first part is the second to last line is the bump, and silence is the set, and the faces of my friends is the spike, and boom.
I love that. That's amazing. Wait, just one more quick point.
Go.
There, and this I was thinking about. So bringing in the rhythmic moves in conversation with our discussion about how this being a more modernist poem, or at least a rejection of the romantic. I do think that the irregular technical enjambments and stranger syntax in the second stanza speaks to the more unconventional modernist style that emerges. One thing that your friend Sam was talking about were poets who had been trained romantically, who then were in World War I, found the conventions and the formal techniques of Romanticism unable to account for and speak to their experience. And so it wasn't just a matter of new images or direct expression, but it was a matter of different formal rhythms and styles that they needed.
And this poem is actually a great example of some of the ways they went about that, because it's a really good point. A lot of what they did was specifically use the techniques they were taught and mess with them and subvert them the way that the society they knew, the religious understandings that they had, all of these assumptions about life were also being disrupted by the war. A lot of the writers, finding that language inadequate, were not just writing in a different way, they were writing against what they had been taught. The subject of the rhythm of the poem, I was just looking at the ends of every line. In the first part of the poem, which is 7 lines, the part that deals with the before time, 2 of those 7 lines end in some form of punctuation, a comma and a period. In the second part of the poem, 7 of the 8 lines end in some form of punctuation, and they are colon, semicolon, period, comma, semicolon, comma, and period.
Yes.
So there is a more propulsive, disrupted use of punctuation, which speaks to the more fragmented and internal conversation that's going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't have
I agree.
anything else. I mean, there's always more to appreciate in this poem.
Yeah.
Really, I had been aware of it, but before doing this podcast had not sat with it the way that I did, the way we do when we're preparing for these. And it is a poem that just really rewards that kind of time and that kind of investigation.
Yeah, and it was cool. I had barely even, maybe not even heard of Sassoon actually before you mentioned this, which is appalling and unforgivable, and I am fessing up to it on air. But it made me think of, because I'd read Wilfred Owen and his poem like Dulce et decorum est, etc. But it was interesting to learn that Owen sort of looked up and admired Sassoon, and now we read Owen in my freshman year history class or something, so he's made it into the canon. Sassoon is like not out of the canon, but people don't, he's much less well known than Owen is, even though during their time Sassoon was the more popular, elder, respected poet. Read it again?
I think we need to read it again.
All right.
When I was young, my heart and head were light, and I was gay and feckless as a colt out in the fields, with morning in the May, wind on the grass, wings in the orchard bloom. Oh, thrilling sweet my joy when life was free, and all the paths led on from hawthorn-time across the caroling meadows into June. But now, my heart is heavy-laden. I sit, burning my dreams away beside the fire, for death has made me wise and bitter and strong. and I am rich in all that I have lost. O starshine on the fields of long ago, bring me the darkness and the nightingale, dim wealds of vanished summer, peace of home, and silence, and the faces of my friends. Thank you, Deep State Radio nerds, for suggesting this poem.
Yes, thank you so much.
Big shout out and big thanks.
Yeah, let us know what you think.
Yeah, let us know what you think about this episode. And everybody else, let us know what you think. We want to hear from you. If you have suggestions for episodes, we will take them seriously and do episodes about them. Just ask at Deep State Radio Nerds.
This is proof. This is literal proof.
You can tweet us with suggestions for poems or comments on any of our episodes at Close Talking for the show, at Hot Sauce Boxed for Connor, at Jack Rossiter Munn for me. And you can also find us on Facebook, facebook.com/close talking, or you can send us an email at closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com. We want to hear from you.
Boom.
That was real fun. This is co-host Jack Rossiter Munley. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts. Leave a review. 5 stars maybe? Those reviews help with the algorithm and are a great way for us to find new listeners. And you can put anything in them. You can write whatever you want. You can just say, oh, this is a good podcast. I like this podcast. You could be like, hey, that Connor guy, he makes a lot of good points. Jack, why is he doing this outro so long? You know, get him off the mic. Whatever you feel like writing, head on over there. 5 stars. Drop in the review. Do you have thoughts about this poem? Is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? Well, we'd love to hear from you. And there are tons of ways that you can get in touch with us. I mean, I guess you could drop it into an iTunes review. You could be like 5 stars. Hey, why don't you talk about insert name of poet here? But you can also send us an email. That's probably the best way to do it. closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com is our email address. Or you can find us on Twitter. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn. Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. And the show is at Close Talking. On Instagram, you can find us there too. We are at Close Talking Poetry. And we are on Facebook at facebook.com/close talking. We haven't gotten to TikTok yet, and we might never. Who knows? Anything's possible. Speaking of all those social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena, who keeps us active across the internet. And a thank you to all of you for listening. We will see you next time.